Hello and welcome to this community conversation from CBS News Colorado. I'm political specialist Shaun from the Superior Community Center, where over the next hour we will be reflecting on the Marshall Fire, where we are, what we did right and wrong, and what lies ahead. Joining me are Governor Jared Polis, Congressman Joe Neguse, and Colorado Insurance Commissioner Mike Conway, along with State Representative Judy Amabile, who represents Boulder County, and State Senator Lisa Cutter, who chaired the Wildfire Interim Committee this past year. And of course, many fire survivors are here as well, myself included. We, like most of you, never thought our homes, our neighborhoods, our communities would be devastated by wildfire. If the Marshall Fire taught us nothing else, it is that wildfires can happen anywhere. Our hope is that you won't have to endure what we have, that the issues we face will be addressed before the next tragedy. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge all the local government officials here as well. From Superior, Mayor Mark Lasis, Mayor Pro Tem Neil Shaw, and trustees Jen Cowish, Sandy Hammerly, Bob McCool, Stephanie Miller, and Jason Serbu. From Louisville, Mayor Dennis Maloney, Mayor Pro Tem Deb Fahey, and Councilmember Chris Lay, and Boulder County Commissioners Ashley Stolzman, Claire Levy, and Marta Locamine, along with Treasurer Paul Weissman. It means so much that all of you would take time to be here. Thank you. I solicited questions from all three fire-impacted communities that are directed at our state leaders, but we have a microphone here for local leaders to weigh in as needed too. Governor, I want to start with a question for you that really could mean the difference between rebuilding and selling for some homeowners. Representatives Amabile and Kyle Brown, along with Senator Steve Fenberg, have introduced a bill to waive use taxes for fire rebuilds. How confident are you that it will pass this year, and should it cover all homes destroyed in state or federally declared disasters? Also, should any municipal government receive use tax revenues from disaster rebuilds?
So first, I think Representative Kyle Brown is with us. I did want to acknowledge him. I saw him earlier.
He wasn't sure he would.
I thought I saw him. Okay.
He had a committee hearing.
We also have from our team Kevin Klein, our emergency coordinator for the state, Rick Garcia, DOLA director, our main interface with local government. I think it's probably going to be a better questioner for Senator Cutter what the chances are. I support it, of course, exempting from use tax, rebuilding for the funds, and then I think the question the legislature will have is, does this apply to, or who does it apply to going forward? Right. And I think in your question you said fires that are elevated to state fires, so that could be one example of a criteria. Most fires in our state, and sadly we have hundreds of them every year, are local fires handled by the county. They never go to become state disasters, so presumably they likely wouldn't receive this treatment. So the question is how you set up the criteria, and then they have a question about how they do it backward looking versus forward looking. That'll be a legitimate question too. But I think certainly the concept's a good one. I support it, and hopefully it's something that the legislators will get done.
A related question: about half the homes destroyed in the Marshall Fire have not even applied for a permit to rebuild. Should use tax be waived? That use tax waiver be extended to these people to help rebuild the community?
So first of all, we did just pass a milestone. Half of the homes destroyed now have, there's building permits in place for more than half. Yeah, just more than half. So that threshold is one that we just celebrate recently being reached. I was just talking to some of you earlier. Some of you plan to sell your property. I was talking to a few of you kind of with different plans. I think now you're getting into saying, would this use tax waiver be, I guess, transferable if you're sold your property? Correct. And therefore add to the value? It's really a question, again, for the legislature. I don't think that determines the fate of the effort or not. It would obviously add to the cost of it. Clearly, the goal is to encourage a strong community as to why you would do it. Some people, for many reasons, might not want to rebuild. It could be economic, but it also could just be trauma. You can't live in this. You don't want to live in the same place, and you have to do something different. It could be. I have another friend who was actually planning to move within a year or two anyway, and downsize, and then their home was destroyed. So I mean, all sorts of situations people have.
Senator Cutter, in asking this question, I think too, a lot of these use taxes, at least in the coming years, are going to be redistributed to the entire state as Tabor refunds. So do you think that something like this would stand a chance in light of that?
Well, that's a good question, Shaun. We've talked a little bit about this, I know, and I would hope so. I mean, I think it's a really important issue, and I agree with the governor. It's something that we need to do. And there's great bill sponsors behind, people working on this issue. So I'm confident that they'll craft it in such a way that it's going to be meaningful. But yeah, it's important.
I'm going to ask about another bill, Senate Bill 206, which was passed last year. It's enacted almost a year ago, and yet very few funds have been dispersed as a result of this. It's $20 million, so it was the big wildfire bill. Many fire victims say the qualifications are simply too restrictive. How do you address this?
So the money will get out. It doesn't go to anything else. But to put it in perspective, of the roughly over 1,000 homes lost, this is estimated to provide up to 50,000 to about 220. And that's after, the reason you ask kind of why it's not out, it's the last source of gap funds. So it's after you're settled with insurance, you're settled with your other things, and there's still a gap. The state, fairly unprecedented. We were able to do this. We don't do this for many things. In part, it was because we had a lot of what we call one-time money, ARPA and other things. We set aside this $20 million, which will help about 220-ish people up to 50,000. But because it's the last piece in, everything else has to resolve itself first in terms of what people are getting.
So one of the complaints from residents and first responders was that we do not have a coordinated uniform alert and warning system for the state. California just adopted a system, has text, emails, voicemails. When will Colorado?
Yeah, I think first of all, a lot of lessons were learned with this, and we do have a system to accomplish these. So some of you've all probably gotten missing person texts and other things like that. So we have the ability to do, and we would do, it has to come up from a local request, but a basically geo-fenced version of that. Things are very different than they were 20 years ago, right? People had landlines and you knew where they were and you did outbound calls. That doesn't reach a lot of people these days, and you don't know who's living where. So what you do is you use the new technology, and we say everybody who has a cell phone, regardless of their provider, who's in this area, gets a message. So that's what's being integrated with disaster response. It starts at local, but the state has that capability. We do that. You've probably gotten them for other things. Tornado warnings we do also, but that's the kind of thing that we're going to do more of.
And so the request would have to come from a local government to do something like that? It
does. It all happens relatively rapidly with something like a fire, but we don't initiate them, but they come up through us and we deliver on them with our technology.
So we incentivize retrofitting our homes for energy efficiency with federal tax breaks and state incentives. Where are the incentives for safety? Will you support launching similar incentives to help people retrofit their homes to comply with the 5-foot non-combustion zone that is part of most WUI recommendations, as well as indoor sprinklers? And I think Congressman Neguse, you could jump in on this as well, since we are talking about both federal and state tax breaks here.
Sure, you'd like me to start?
Sure.
Well, first, just doubling back on the question that you just posed to the governor, I know the sheriff is here from Boulder County and many of his deputies as well. And just recently we were able to secure about $2 million, a little less than that, of congressionally directed spending to help enhance Boulder County's alert system through the sheriff's office, and grateful to work with them in partnership. Sorry, I don't know if my microphone, I'll talk a little louder, my apologies. All right. So with respect to your second question regarding potential grants, both at the state and federal level for homeowners, that's certainly something we support. There are successful programs that have worked in the past. A great example is Firewise. Part of the challenge, I think, and this is a paradigm shift that I suspect we'll talk about a little bit today, is most of those dollars traditionally have gone to homes that have been firmly within the WUI. So, you think about in Boulder County, places like Netherland and Lyons, Allens Park, and so forth. Clearly, that is no longer sufficient. And we're going to have to make sure that those grant dollars are available to more suburban and urban communities, places like Superior, Louisville, Lafayette, and so forth. So yes, the short answer is I think that there are potential ways that we can boost, plus up the Firewise programs at the national level, and perhaps calibrate them a little bit better so that the money is available more broadly as opposed to more segmented to some of these more the communities that I just described.
And to those of you back there who did not hear Congressman Negus's his original statement, he said you've secured $2 million to help with a statewide alert system.
So just with respect to the first question that Shaun posed, I certainly support a statewide alert system. In the interim, we've worked with the Boulder County Sheriff, both the new sheriff but also his predecessor, Sheriff Pelley, and the county commissioners to secure about $2 million in congressional directed spending to help enhance and improve their existing alert system. But of course, as you said, Shaun, there's a need for uniformity at the state level, and that's certainly something I support.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is going to be, and we have, so we can deliver them, but remember the flip side of this. You certainly don't want to get a bunch of alerts you don't care about on your phone too. That really upsets people. I think there was one that Jeffco did that people shouldn't have gotten that they got. So this kind of thing happens. So it's the right balance. We want to make sure we can do it, but we don't want to make sure it just doesn't automatically flow through, and every time local government wants to nag you about something, you get a text. But for the true emergencies, we can deliver on that.
And in terms of state incentives for safety?
Yeah, so we also are looking at, with our housing recovery and rebuilding program, covering up to $30,000 for different mitigation activities, including $10,000 for sprinkler systems. So we have that available, and we're looking at additional incentives as well.
Great. The damage inflicted by the Marshall Fire was multiplied dramatically by the failure to maintain the Boulder County open space. The dried grasses were well over 2 feet tall across the open space, and yet there were no funds allocated to mow, disc, graze, or otherwise mitigate the fire danger. 15 months after the fire, none of that has changed. The county has indicated that they have applied for funds but don't have a commitment, and have not used their existing general funds for this either. So there is a lot of attention paid to mitigation of forests, Congressman Negus, as you pointed out, watersheds, but grass mitigation, that's something relatively new. In Boulder County alone, we have 373 miles of grasses that are long and dry for most of the year, and they surround our community. Will you commit to helping and or mandating action to mitigate this threat? And I think both of you can jump in on this one as well, and Senator Cutter too.
Sure, so just to step in, certainly with helping our local communities access those resources, that's certainly something we're supportive of. I'll defer to the governor as to whether or not the mandate piece of that at the state level. Just again, taking a step back, and I think everyone here is certainly aware of this, but in the last 3 years, we had the 3 largest or most destructive wildfires in the history of Colorado. All happened within the 2nd Congressional District that I represent. The Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Fire in Larimer County and in Grand County, respectively, were the largest fires in the history of our state. And yet the Marshall Fire, which was one of the smallest geographically, ultimately was the most destructive economically. And empirical data suggests it's going to be the 10th most destructive fire in terms of cost in the country, in the history of the country. And so from my perspective, again, it dovetails with the paradigm shift I described earlier. There's a lot of money that thankfully has been brought to bear to address the mitigation needs in our federal lands, our national forests, and we've been a big advocate for that, my office and myself during my tenure in Congress. We're 15 miles away from the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, as we all know, White River National Forest, many others. We're bringing a lot of federal resources to those areas to do critical mitigation work. I don't think that has necessarily been the case historically in some of the more urban, suburban corridors. And as I talked to my other fellow members of the congressional delegation in Colorado, tried to sort of implore them as much as I can to remember that the next big fire, the most destructive fire, is not necessarily going to happen out in a national forest where that mitigation work is occurring every day, but in Ken Carroll or Arvada or Highlands Ranch or Golden, these communities that are clearly right adjacent to, or in some cases are at the border of the WUI. So short answer is yes. I'm sure the county officials can answer during the next segment about their decision making from a perspective standpoint, but there are federal dollars available, and we'll certainly continue to fight for that.
The state also has taken steps and will take additional steps to reduce the cost for cities or counties, and also I would add private landowners that want to do this kind of mitigation. So I would say the main thing that we are doing to assist is we have the Youth Conservation Corps through AmeriCorps. So these are mostly 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and We do this every summer. We do a program. I think we do 1 or 2 off season too, and we do a number of them across the state. I've been out with them near Evergreen and in El Paso County, and we have in the aggregate a few hundred of them across the state. So we're available at a much lower cost because it's not commercial. It's with state AmeriCorps funds administered under Lieutenant Governor Diane Primavera, our Lieutenant Governor, where upon request we're able to go out and deploy the Youth Conservation Corps for trees, grass, for other kinds of mitigation. So we have that available as a tool for both private landowners and counties and other landowners to be able to help reduce their costs of taking these kinds of measures.
Senator Cutter, do you think, I mean, is this ripe for legislation, maybe to mandate something like this?
We don't like the word mandate.
Especially unfunded mandates, right?
Exactly, exactly. You know, I was thinking the governor and Congressman Neguse covered some great points, and it just demonstrates how wildfires are evolving, and how the landscape is evolving, and climate change is creating situations that we've not had before. And I think that's what, I've been on the Wildfire Matters Interim Committee my entire time as a legislator. I love working in that space. And that's something that we really try to do, is look forward and try to help prevent and do everything we can to set up to be resilient. So I'm sure that's a topic that we'll be tackling this summer when we meet.
Okay, thank you. While the focus has rightfully been on the homes that were destroyed by the fire, there were also many, many homes, including my own, that were damaged by the heat, as well as the smoke, the soot, and the ash that's filled with microscopic, toxic heavy metals from the cars, the appliances, et cetera, that burned. Not only are there no industry regulations for remediation of houses or contents, there is no standard for clean or safe. There isn't even a testing protocol. Restoration companies charge tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantees, and it's up to insurers to decide what they'll cover. Should there be standards that govern remediation after a fire like this, including, this is going to be a question for all of you, what insurers have to cover, what constitutes clean and safe, and how that's determined? Should there be mandatory testing before families move back in? And Commissioner Conway, I'll start with you. Let's start with the insurer part of this.
Sure, Shaun, and I'll keep talking and hopefully this will pick up and you can all hear me. But Shaun, I want to start with something that you said at the front end, that you felt like you're one of the lucky ones because you didn't lose your home. That's something that quite often, folks, that when a fire like this happens and we have conversations with people that have had what we refer to as partial losses, the smoke, soot, and ash damage, they often refer to themselves as the lucky ones, and they're not. Just to be very clear, nobody impacted by this fire is lucky. Nobody impacted by any fire is lucky. And some of the hardest challenges that we have after a fire like this are the folks that have partial losses in their home, the people that have the smoke, soot, and ash damage. Because of everything that you just said, Shaun. Actually figuring out the right way and the right kind of manner to clean homes and get them back to the condition that they were before the fire is an incredibly difficult thing to do. There aren't standards today. It's something that we're engaging with in conversations across the country with our counterparts around the country. I think implicit in your question is, should there be standards? And the absolute answer is yes. And we need to work with partners both within state agencies, other state agencies like CDPHE, to figure out what those standards are. Our counterparts in other states, the consumer advocates of the world like United Policyholders that do really great work in this space can help us figure those pieces out, but we're going to lead on that front. We're going to lead on that front in Colorado because we have to have these standards in a world where climate change is impacting us in such huge ways, where we have fires like this that are going to recur. We have to figure out how to solve for this problem, and we're going to do that.
Should it be done at the federal level, Congressman Neguse?
I guess what I would say, Shaun, I think certainly at the state level there's a role for the state to play, and property and casualty insurance largely regulated by the states through NAIC, and Commissioner Conway, the work that he does working with his counterparts is probably the best body in which those standards should flow. Doesn't mean that there's not a role for federal regulatory agencies to provide some guidance and some sense as to what they think might be the best course. But in terms of federal legislation, I think that is a bit trickier on an issue like this that can be very dependent upon the particular circumstances or nature of a landscape or of a state.
And it sounds like this is something that can be done at the regulatory level, doesn't necessarily need to be done statutorily.
Correct. I don't think it needs to be statutory.
A related question, Colorado has a warranty of habitability law. But because there is no definition of what constitutes sufficient remediation, renters are at the mercy of their landlords. They have zero recourse. We've had families leave the area because they couldn't get their rental unit fully cleaned. Others who can't afford to move are stuck living in a place that impacts their health. Will you help establish a health-based standard for multifamily dwellings to help ease these renters after disasters? Governor?
So I think we actually are now working with the legislature on a way to ensure post-wildfire renter safety. And as I said, very importantly, when I was interviewing folks for to hire a state insurance commissioner when I became governor, and I interviewed Mike Conway, we said we want a consumer advocate, somebody who really fights for consumers for this position. And that's what he has done, and that's what he's doing. Many of you were probably on Zooms with him shortly after. He was incredibly available for multiple town halls and phone calls with people. He goes to bat for people. He's doing his job so well that some of the insurers and special interests tried to run a bill to say he had to run for office, and the governor could no longer appoint him because they thought they could get him out with spending all the dark money against him. But he's doing a great job fighting for consumers, and he's dealt with some of you individually, but and really tried to make sure that we want to help get what you deserve from insurance companies.
I would agree with that. I took an issue to him from one homeowner, and he saved this homeowner from foreclosure. His office did. So
just to be clear, folks, it's not me. It's the people at the Division of Insurance, right? I get to be the face of these things, and I get to come out and talk at these events. But the people that do the work are the people that you all are working with every day. It's the team at the division. They're awesome. They care about you all immensely. I promise you that, and that's what we're here for.
Another insurance-related question. Many homeowners are having an incredibly difficult time accessing their insurance money to rebuild because mortgage servicers are sitting on it, and in some cases actually making interest off this money. They will tell a homeowner their house has to be 20% complete, for example, but they won't tell them what constitutes 20%, or will refuse to give them money for windows that they ordered until those windows are actually installed. Will you address this, either through regulation or legislation, to require mortgage servicers to pay insurance proceeds in a timely manner and give homeowners market rate interest on that money? And this could be any one of you, I think, could answer this one.
I will jump in really quick. I will just say that I had been unaware of that issue until you and I discussed it, and it is appalling, and we do need to do something. So I will just tell you, I've been asking a lot of questions, and I believe there's lots going on. We're doing a lot of research around it, and I'm hopeful that something will happen to be supportive.
Soon?
Yeah, soonish. Yeah. It's hard to say, but we're very aware of the issue at the legislature and have been having conversations. So I'm hopeful.
And I know you're aware of it too, Commissioner Conway.
To build on the senator's point, I do think that it's vitally important for us to learn more about exactly what you're talking about, Shaun, and have these conversations directly with the community to understand it. It's not within my purview to regulate mortgage lenders. Probably they're relatively happy about that. But I do think that there are other state agencies that we can work with to figure out potential solutions. I think the senator being committed to finding those solutions is fantastic, but there's, I think, maybe opportunities for us to work with some of our sister agencies as well.
And this is probably something that needs to be dealt with at the state level, Congressman Neguse, right? And I know Senator Cutter can say working with the AG's office on this, right?
That's where I've been inquiring, correct.
More than 260 community members have signed a petition asking Boulder Valley School District to verify schools impacted by the fire are safe, using an accredited industrial hygienist to gather tape and vacuum samples to test for toxic fire byproducts. Should there be state or federal regulations for smoke-damaged schools as well as homes?
Certainly supportive of the petition that the parents and the families have signed, and happy to be an advocate with the school board locally for them to take those steps. And to the extent the school board decides to do that, we'll work with them to partner on federal resources that might be available. Again, I think in terms of federal standards, that's probably unlikely, and probably a better course would be for state and local jurisdictions to be able to come to
I think this ties into the homeowners.
We have some money at Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE, from, thanks to Congressman Neguse, federal COVID for clean air in schools. So the thought was more the COVID side, but same technology. They're basically, some of you might have it. You can use it to buy like the Blue Air things and all those different air purifiers. So that is underutilized, meaning we have more money than the schools have requested. So absolutely, we'd encourage school district to tap into those funds at BVC. I don't know if an allowable use is that testing side, but the purification side is what they're for, and so we'd love more districts to actually deploy that money from Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment.
Right, a lot of people don't even know that the money's there.
It's there
right.
for our schools. Yeah, thanks to Congressman Neguse and others, Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Bennett.
So more and more homeowners in the burn scar area say their insurance companies are dropping them for no apparent reason. We have a condo complex just up the hill here. It's that way up the hill. 200 units. They have checked with 400 carriers and have been denied insurance, and their insurance policy expires April 1st. How worried are you, Commissioner Conway, that insurers will leave Colorado due to the high fire risk here? And how soon are insurers going to start requiring mitigation as a condition of insurance?
So, Shaun, our team is working with that particular townhome, the group that's the HOA with that townhome to try and help them find a solution. I'm not, as I sit here right now, I'm not worried about insurance companies leaving the state wholesale. I am worried about insurance companies leaving parts of the state. But thankfully, because of Rep. Amable and Speaker McCluskey, we're very hopeful that we're going to be running a bill this session to help address that issue. So 32 states have what is referred to as a FAIR plan, a Fair Access to Insurance Requirements plan. And really what that is, it's an insurer of last resort for homeowners or communities if the private marketplace doesn't want to provide coverage. It really can be a relief valve for the state, for the insurance industry as a whole, when there's this much uncertainty, again, that's directly related to climate change and the uncertainty that climate change and the impact that it's going to have. But I think as far as your question regarding mitigation, Shaun, there are, in certain parts of the state, the insurance companies are requiring mitigation in order to actually cover homes in those parts of the state. I think that may very well grow, to the Congressman's points earlier about kind of the work that is being done outside of what we traditionally think of as high fire areas. That's gonna spread to the mitigation conversation with insurance companies too. I think part of what we have to address going forward is, one, encouraging that mitigation, absolutely, but then we also have to, I think, take steps to help people actually do the mitigation, whether that's encouraging the insurance companies to decrease premiums when folks do mitigate, or other mechanisms, but that's going to be an important part of the conversation going forward.
Senator Cutter, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would, because it's a little peripheral, but I think it applies here. I just have been working really hard on a bill to create a minimum standard building code. Right. And the reason I bring that up in this context is because insurance companies came out in strong support yesterday in committee. And so I think that doing things like that to help us build more resiliency and create better communities in the long run can really help with insurance pressure and things like that.
And for those who aren't aware of your bill, maybe address too, I know there's quite a few people in this room too probably who've had trouble with their HOAs saying you got to put in wood chips or a wood fence or no fire hardening for your siding.
Actually, someone came to me with that concern that a community, maybe some of you are here today, a community was requiring you to rebuild with wooden fences. Really, yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't know that there's anything we can do at this point, but when the bill, when the board is established and the code is established, it will supersede HOA codes. So it will not happen moving forward should this bill pass.
We've done a few things in related areas where HOAs were, they have their function, of course, but getting in the way. One was we had HOAs that were banning EV charging stations and HOAs that were banning solar panels. So different contexts, but we actually took their authority away through a law. They can no longer ban solar if you want it. They can no longer ban EV charging. So this could be a similar thing where probably late for this session, but in the future, let's look at saying you can't ban fire mitigation. Like you can't ban fire. Exactly. It seems like a logical thing. Why? It's not in the interest of an HOA to ban fire mitigation, but nevertheless, probably some of them do. So might be an area to look at for the future.
It seemed to be a no-brainer, right? On the day of the fire, believe it or not, there was no water, not a single working hydrant in all of Marshall, the historic coal mining town where the fire started. It took a half hour, I'm told, for trucks to leave, get water, and return. A cistern there is now 1/3 full. It's broken, so it can't be fully filled, I guess, but there is still no pressurized water in that area. And it draws thousands of hikers every week to that area. It's also home to the coal seam fires, which we've heard about and which we'd all like to know more about. What will you do to make sure the situation in Marshall and similar areas around the state is addressed in an urgent manner?
Well, I would just say that actually many fires start in areas that are even more remote and further from water access than the Marshall area. So we have the only practical response for vast majority of our state geographically is going to be an aerial response. So we have now purchased our first fire helicopter. We're on our way towards a second. We lease capacity, but keep in mind that none of this would have been applicable for this particular fire when winds were at 70, 80 miles an hour. You recall it was a different situation. But what we are doing is upping our statewide bar, because what we found is that historically, Colorado relied on an interstate pool of tankers and aircraft. The problem is, A, they took longer to deploy, but B, when there's a fire in New Mexico, California, Colorado, Iowa, we were even down the list and they were elsewhere. So we found that with climate change and the increased risk, we need to really control more of those resources to deploy wherever they're needed in our state. And as I said, many of the fires are in areas they start in areas more remote, and then obviously the great danger is when they come towards populated areas.
Well, I think that was the concern about Marshall, is that it is so close to a populated area and yet did not have access to the water. So it is something that I think, people here just want to raise that to the state, to make sure that you're aware of that, because there are probably other areas around the state that fit this bill as well that need this addressed in an urgent manner, not after the fire, right? The Marshall fire damage was exacerbated by the condition of private ditches. Because of the senior land use rights of ditch companies, there has been a long-standing situation where large amounts of fire fuel in the form of dried dead wood and weeds has been piled up or just left in the ditches themselves. The fire was conducted by those ditches, in my neighborhood especially. Yet it seems that the ditch companies have no responsibility to clean the ditches or dispose of the resulting debris piles when created. Do you support state or federal grants for private ditch companies that interface with communities and requiring them to clear debris in the spring and again within the 3 months of the annual ditch shutoff? Congressman Neguse?
Yeah, certainly. So the short answer is yes. There's a program at the federal level that exists now that really provides a partnership between forests, national forest mitigation work, and private landowners. So just by way of example, the Cameron Peak Fire up in Larimer County, you have wide swaths of land that's adjacent to national forest, or in some cases right in the middle of national forest. It's privately owned. And this grant program, it's called the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. It's a bill that Senator Bennett and I worked together that codified into law, provides resources for those private landowners to be able to do the mitigation work in partnership with, in this case, the USDA and the Forest Service. We're working now on legislation that we would hope could be a template, essentially, to do that in, again, more urban, suburban areas, thinking open space, private ditch companies, just by way of example, which again is part of that paradigm shift. It's just very different than the way in which certainly the federal government has treated wildfire mitigation previously. So, but yes, short answer is yes.
Governor, did you have anything to add to that?
No, just that every time there is a fire that is elevated to a state fire, there's a action report to address contributing factors, and then we try to align state resources to learn from each event to prevent that kind of event from occurring in the future.
And so this is one of those that's
one of the examples of the action from the action report.
After the floods in Lyons years ago, the state covered 22.5% of the FEMA eligible expenses. The town, 2.5%. With the Marshall fire, the state is covering 5% and the local match is 5%. Boulder County is covering the 5% only for the residents outside of Louisville and Superior. But as you know, all the residents affected by the fire live in Boulder County. As you think about state funding distributions, how do you ensure a community isn't financially penalized? There is a disconnect here between what happened in the floods and the fires, for sure.
Yeah, well, every disaster is different. Now, first of what I think probably many people encountered is basing anything off of the FEMA eligibility wasn't always even very helpful for many people, because a lot of people weren't even eligible for that much under FEMA. What we did, I think that's more impactful, as I said, it's the money that is the state said, first of all, how much can we afford on a one-time basis to direct here, and then B, what's the mechanism? And the mechanism that we arrived upon was this up to $50,000 per person kind of last money in funds, the 20 million. So that's what's there. You could argue different ways. Maybe it should have been just, flat of 10,000 for everybody or whatever it was. But we think so about a quarter of the folks, the last money in, the underinsured, whatever it is, they will get that 50,000. I think there's a 25,000 too that others get. But that's kind of what we thought would be the most impactful with the resources we had. If we had all the money in the world, many of you don't know, unlike the federal government, we have to balance our budget every year. So it actually we can't spend more than we take in. So there's only so much that the legislature and the Joint Budget Committee can appropriate, and 20 million is a significant investment. And so that's kind of the investment that was able to be made and appropriated.
Okay. With the ongoing push for electrification, what proactive steps are being taken as it relates to the increased number of large lithium batteries? Putting the fire out at the Tesla building took priority during the Marshall Fire, and we know the ranks of EVs in homes are growing, as are the number of e-bikes, which started over 200 fires in New York City just last year. So what do you do to prevent
well,
that?
I would say, look, there's no form of energy that's perfect. Also, I would say that overall electrification will decrease fire risks compared to natural gas. So, I mean, as you're looking at, for instance, new buildings and homes that use electricity for heating and stoves, there's a risk for any of those, but it is higher for natural gas. Also, internal combustion engines. As electric vehicles become more efficient and more widespread, I think the risk is comparable to even potentially in the future, probably lower. Obviously, they've had a long time to refine internal combustion engines, but they're still, when a car collides with something, it can absolutely explode, internal combustion engine. So I think the fact that things can be electrical is a way to reduce risk, but it doesn't mean everything electrical is inherently lower risk.
I think, Congressman Neguse, it may be something for you've got a wildfire caucus to think about, these lithium batteries and the number of them that are out there and the growing number of them.
Yeah, I agree. I would certainly concur with the governor, and I think as you were talking about the floods in 2013, we learn something new after every natural disaster that tragically happens in our state. The recovery from the floods in 2013 was very, very, very long, as we know, and many of you lived here in our community and experienced that particular tragedy. So at the end of the day, I agree with you. I think post-disaster, this may be something that we really hadn't sort of encountered previously, right? The pervasiveness of these larger lithium batteries, very different today than a decade ago, 20 years ago. I do think, by the way, though, as the governor said, and this goes back to the prior question that you posed, every disaster is different. And there are lessons we learn. In this particular natural disaster, as many of you all know, thanks to the governor's leadership, the leadership of the delegation, we were able to convince FEMA to grant a very rare approval of cost coverage for damaged foundations for homes, something that FEMA has only done a handful of times, 3 or 4 times. Certainly did not do that back in 2013. So again, every natural disaster is different, and I think it's going to take all of us continuing to work together during what is very likely to be a very long process.
That's a good point.